Sad millionaire CEO dines alone on Christmas Eve. Then a single mother and her twin daughters arrive. Everett Callahan was already seated at the polished mahogany table, his posture meticulously straight, when the waiter returned and quietly announced that the prime rib was delayed. The kitchen, overwhelmed by the Christmas Eve rush, was running late. Everett Callahan nodded, polite as always, his gaze fixed on the perfectly positioned, empty chair across from him. Outside, the city was draped in snow and festive lights, the air thick with the muffled sound of celebration. Inside, the restaurant was a kaleidoscope of laughter and clinking glasses. Yet somehow, the wealthy, 41-year-old CEO was the only soul sitting completely alone in the main dining room. This wasn't just physical solitude. It was a deeply ingrained silence. That wasn't the part that hurt the most. He reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke coat, his fingers brushing against the small, worn velvet box he never opened anymore. It had rested there for years, untouched, a promise of a future frozen in time. Tonight was supposed to be fundamentally different, a part of a life he no longer lived. He had imagined loud, ringing laughter, small, excited voices, two little girls arguing playfully over which dessert they should order. Instead, there was the heavy, luxurious silence of his own making, punctuated only by the distant scrape of cutlery and the cheerful chatter of strangers. Across the room, families leaned toward each other, sharing plates and whispering secrets. Children, bundled in holiday clothes, swung their impatient legs under tables, their faces glowing with innocent excitement. Everett kept his eyes fixed downward, pretending his phone held a message more compelling than the sharp, familiar ache in his chest. He told himself this was just another business dinner, just another Tuesday night. But Christmas Eve never lets you lie. It demands that you face what you lack. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything, shattering walls built over decades. He checked his wristwatch, not because he had a schedule to keep. His schedule was meticulously clear tonight. Nothing, but because waiting felt marginally easier than remembering why he hated nights that screamed of home and belonging. The chair across from him stayed empty, perfectly aligned with the table's edge, painfully intentional. That chair had been reserved, in spirit, for someone who never made it this far, and he'd built an entire financial empire trying not to dwell on that profound absence. Then the heavy oak restaurant door opened again, admitting a sudden sharp gust of cold air and a flurry of swirling snow. A woman stepped inside, quickly brushing flakes from the shoulder of her slightly damp coat, holding the mittened hands of two small children. The girls were startlingly identical. Same thick, brown curls escaping their knitted hats. Same bright, curious eyes. Same oversized red bows clipped unevenly to their hair. They scanned the bustling room like it was a magnificent, overwhelming wonderland. Everett didn't look up immediately, but something subtle shifted in the restaurant's atmosphere. The emotional equilibrium tilted. The hostess leaned down to speak quietly to the woman, pointing toward a cramped corner table near the service entrance. Suddenly, one of the girls tugged free of her mother's grip, her polished shoes tapping softly on the marble floor. She stopped walking and stared directly at Everett. Her expression was not curious, nor was it shy. It was a look of complete certainty, as if she had navigated the noisy, confusing room and found exactly who she was looking for. Everett felt it before he actually saw her, that visceral, unnerving pull you get just before a moment is about to fundamentally alter your trajectory. He raised his eyes slowly, completely unprepared for the small, unwavering face watching him so closely. The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him with the intense scrutiny of a scholar, and then she offered a small, sincere smile. She took a deliberate step closer, utterly unafraid. Her sister whispered a sharp, cautionary sound behind her, but the first girl didn't pause. Everett opened his mouth, but no sound came out, unsure why his heart had instantly started racing against his ribs. He had no idea what she was about to say, and no idea that his life, so carefully constructed, was about to split in two directions. Everett Callahan had built his world, his fortune, and his sanity around things that didn't ask inconvenient questions. Numbers made immediate sense. Global financial systems behaved predictably. Companies followed precise rules if you were accurate and clinical enough. People, on the other hand, were painfully unpredictable. That's why he'd spent the last decade learning to keep a careful, calculated distance. It was certainly safer that way. Or at least that's the doctrine he repeated to himself every morning. At 41, Everett was known throughout the city as a self-made millionaire CEO. His company was cutting-edge financial technology, known for its clean reputation, zero scandals, and absolutely no drama. Magazines loved to label him disciplined, focused, and utterly unstoppable. What they tactfully omitted were the sterile, empty apartments he called home or the holidays he spent methodically pretending that work was, in fact, enough to sustain a life. Years ago, there had been someone, a woman who laughed easily and often, whose energy was the perfect foil to his restraint. She truly believed he would eventually learn to slow down, to live in the present. She used to gently tease him about his meticulously organized calendars and his non-negotiable deadlines. She'd already picked names for their future children, sketching them into the margins of his business reports. 2 girls, she'd always said, always 2. Then life, in its quiet, relentless cruelty, stepped in and took her away. No grand tragedy, no warnings, no villains to blame. Just a succinct, terrifying phone call that permanently split time in half, before and after. Everett had learned how to survive that devastating day by systematically shutting down his most vital emotional engine. Love became a locked room he never reopened. Work became the impenetrable fortress where grief couldn't possibly reach him. Since then, he measured life strictly in financial quarters and escalating profits. He expanded offices globally, hired huge teams, and signed contracts worth astronomical sums. He bought silence with long hours and iron control. And when people inevitably asked why he never remarried, he simply offered a polite, practiced smile. Some stories were far easier left entirely untold. Christmas Eve was always the hardest night of the calendar year. It was a constant, blinding reminder of detailed plans that never made it past imagination. Tonight, he'd deliberately chosen this specific, prestigious restaurant because it was guaranteed to be busy, loud, and full of people. Crowds, paradoxically, made loneliness far easier to conceal. No one noticed one quiet man when the room was roaring with cheer. He sat perfectly straight, hands folded neatly on the linen, projecting an air of belonging. The waiter recognized him immediately, but treated him with the same professional deference as everyone else. Everett appreciated that impartiality. No special attention, no pitying glances, just another customer waiting for dinner. That was when he allowed himself to notice the woman more clearly. Lauren. She wasn't dressed for the place. Her coat was practical, not fashionable, but she didn't look uncomfortable either. She moved with quiet purpose, gently guiding the 2 identical girls, who were whispering excitedly to each other, their eyes wide with genuine wonder. Everett felt a sudden, sharp tightening in his chest before his mind could process the reason. He'd imagined that exact scene once. Not this specific woman, not these exact girls. But the shape of the tableau was excruciatingly familiar. A mother, 2 daughters, a Christmas Eve spent together, the blueprint of a future he'd never stepped into. He looked away instantly, annoyed at his own sentimental weakness. This was just a coincidence, just memory playing cruel tricks on a vulnerable night. He had absolutely no place in anyone else's family narrative. That chapter was closed, sealed, finished, or so he believed, right up until the moment one of the girls, Ava, he would soon learn, walked toward him. The girl stopped directly beside Everett's table, close enough that he could clearly see the scatter of tiny freckles across the bridge of her nose. She wasn't smiling like a child asking for a candy or a toy. She looked serious, profoundly contemplative, as if she had just made an immensely important decision and fully intended to stand by it. Everett straightened instinctively, unsure why his chest felt suddenly paralyzed. He had no protocol, no business strategy, for how to speak to a moment like this. "Sir," she said softly, her small voice startlingly clear over the low hum of the restaurant activity. Nobody should be alone on Christmas Eve. Her words landed gently, effortlessly, but they sank deep, straight into the core of him. Everett blinked, genuinely caught off guard by how simple and absolutely true the statement sounded. Around them, the immediate area seemed to momentarily hold its breath. Behind the girl, the woman, Lauren, froze entirely, her eyes widening in quiet, cold panic. "I'm so sorry." She rushed in, already taking a step forward, her voice laced with tension. "She's just very observant." Her hand reached automatically for the girl's shoulder, ready to gently pull her back and execute a swift, mortified retreat. Everett raised his palm slightly, a barely perceptible gesture, signaling that it was completely all right. The second girl, Lily, peeked out from behind her sister. An identical face but a completely different, cautious energy. She watched Everett closely, sheer curiosity written all over her small expression. The first girl tilted her head, patiently waiting for an answer. There was no fear in her posture, no shadow of doubt in her stance, only absolute certainty, as if kindness was the single most natural law of the world. "Would you like 3 good companions for dinner?" the girl added, her tone negotiating a serious contract. Just for tonight. Everett felt something deep under his ribs shift position. Something warm, heavy, and unfamiliar he hadn't touched in years. He thought of the empty, reserved chair across from him. He thought of how long it had been since anyone had asked him to share space, let alone share a holiday. Lauren's cheeks flushed a painful crimson as she tried again to apologize, her voice tight with professional embarrassment. "We didn't mean to interrupt," she insisted. "We were just passing by on the way to our table." Everett shook his head slowly, his mind desperately racing to catch up with the sudden, overwhelming surge in his heart rate. "No," he said gently, surprising even himself with the soft sincerity of the reply. He looked at the girl, then at her sister, then back to the cautious mother. "Yes," Everett said again, clearer this time, injecting authority into the fragile hope. "I would like that very much." The first girl smiled immediately. Not wide or loud, but utterly satisfied, like something profoundly important had gone exactly the way it was meant to. The woman hesitated, caught between her instinctual pride and a softer, desperate need. The girls looked up at her face, hope glowing visibly in their eyes. Everett gestured toward the empty chair, then the ample space beside it. "There's more than enough food," he said quietly, assuring her that this was not a burden. And just like that, without another word, 3 complete strangers stepped unhesitatingly into a story none of them had planned, shattering Everett's silence forever. Lauren Whitmore hesitated for 1 second longer than she should have. It wasn't because she didn't trust the wealthy man, Everett. It was because she didn't trust moments like this. Life had drilled into her the brutal lesson that truly good things rarely arrived without invisible strings attached, and those strings usually ended up choking you later. She had learned to protect her daughters first, even from kindness, especially from kindness that felt too generous, too sudden, and too unreal to sustain. The girls, however, needed no convincing, operating entirely on pure instinct. They slid into the deep, plush chairs with careful, contained excitement, hands folded neatly on the table's edge, eyes bright. They looked around the setting, the heavy cutlery, the crystal glasses, the starched linen, like it was something sacred. A Christmas Eve dinner shared with a stranger felt immensely important to them. Lauren watched every flicker of Everett's expression closely, ready to intervene instantly if anything felt even slightly wrong. Everett noticed her tension immediately. He recognized that guarded look, the one that said every gesture, every word, was being meticulously measured and weighed. He immediately softened his posture, lowering his voice, consciously slowing his movements. He didn't want to overwhelm her or the girls with the sheer force of his presence or his wealth. He just wanted the crushing silence that had been his constant companion to finally stop feeling so heavy. "I'm Everett," he said gently, offering nothing more than his simple name, devoid of any title or status. Lauren nodded, still radiating caution. "I'm Lauren," she replied, resting a hand lightly on the table, reassuring the girls of her presence. "And these are my daughters." She paused, then managed a faint, tired smile. "Ava and Lily." The girls introduced themselves at the exact same moment, then immediately burst into soft giggles at the collision of their voices. Their pure, uncomplicated laughter cut through the oppressive formality surrounding Everett like warm, unexpected light. It reminded him of a sound he'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Not polished, not controlled, just completely alive and free. He felt something deep in his chest loosen, just a fraction. The waiter returned promptly, professional menus in hand, his eyes flicking subtly between the unusual grouping of the four people. Everett noticed Lauren's shoulders tense again, preparing for the inevitable uncomfortable conversation about payment or seating. He spoke quickly, calmly, before any discomfort could fully settle. "They'll join me," he said simply, settling the matter. No explanation was offered, no authority asserted, just a firm, simple invitation to belong. As the waiter retreated, a fresh, awkward quiet settled momentarily at the table. Lauren glanced at Everett, searching his face, trying to decode his true intention. The girls, oblivious to the adult tension, swung their legs under the table, whispering private observations to each other. Everett stared down at the intricately woven tablecloth, suddenly unsure of himself. This was unfamiliar territory, completely outside the world of spreadsheets and acquisitions, and it scared him more than any multibillion-dollar business risk ever had. Lauren finally broke the silence, her voice careful, but honest. "We didn't plan this," she said softly, needing him to understand this wasn't a setup. "We almost didn't come out tonight at all." Everett looked up, meeting her weary, honest eyes for the very first time. "Then I'm truly glad you did," he replied, and meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. Something fragile hung between them, unspoken but profoundly powerful. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't a rescue operation. It was four people walking a thin, dangerous line between hope and fear. Everett realized that whatever happened next mattered deeply, because this wasn't just about sharing a dinner anymore. He looked at the girls again, then back at Lauren. For the first time in many years, he felt completely exposed. Not exposed as a CEO, not as a man with unlimited resources, but as someone who had been alone for too long and who wasn't sure how to ask for help without completely breaking down. The food arrived, filling the table with rich warmth and deeply familiar, comforting smells. Lauren relaxed slightly as the girls focused immediately and entirely on their plates. Ava meticulously arranged her napkin and silverware before touching her food, while Lily, predictably, immediately started quizzing the waiter about the dessert menu. Everett watched this small, practiced routine unfold, noticing how meticulous and protective Lauren was. This wasn't a regular, special occasion for them. This was clearly something rare, something costly. They ate quietly at first, the kind of quiet that comes from deep caution, not genuine discomfort. Everett eventually asked the girls what they liked best about Christmas. Ava said she loved the colorful lights, because they made everything outside look kinder. Lily, ever the humanitarian, said she liked when people smiled more than usual. Lauren offered a quick, fleeting smile at that, then quickly looked down at her plate. Everett, keeping his tone light and non-invasive, asked where they were coming from. Lauren hesitated for a long beat, then answered honestly. They lived a few subway stops away, in a small, cramped apartment. Christmas Eve dinners out were absolutely not a tradition. Tonight was something she had promised herself she would try to create for them, regardless of the financial cost. She explained that she worked 2 jobs, mostly evenings, and the girls stayed with a kind neighbor most nights. Tonight, she desperately wanted to be present. Fully, deeply present, even if just for a few stolen hours. She admitted that the grand restaurant had felt overwhelmingly intimidating when they walked in. She had almost turned around and gone home at the door. Everett listened without interrupting, a skill he had learned the hard way in high-stakes negotiations. He noticed the way Lauren avoided certain details. He noticed how carefully she chose every word. This wasn't a story she told often. It was a story shaped by relentless exhaustion and crushing responsibility. One of the girls looked up suddenly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Mom," Ava said matter-of-factly. "Tell him why Christmas Eve matters to us." Lauren stiffened, clearly caught off guard by the directness of her daughter. She took a slow, visible breath, then nodded slowly. Their father had passed away years ago. Not suddenly or dramatically, but quietly gone after a long, draining illness. Christmas Eve had always been his absolute favorite night of the year. It was the one deeply personal tradition Lauren refused to let disappear entirely. Everett felt the weight of her words land heavier than he expected. Loss recognized loss without need for any further explanation. He didn't share his own story yet, but something inside him shifted fundamentally, settling into a new, stable position. This dinner was no longer accidental. Everett didn't rush to respond after Lauren spoke about her husband because rushing had never helped anyone navigate genuine pain. He let the silence exist, not as something awkward or empty, but as space, the rare, necessary kind people rarely give when they don't know what to say. The girls continued eating, completely at ease, as if this table had always been theirs, as if the silence was normal. That inherent ease stayed with him, settling somewhere deep in the cavern where loneliness usually resided. He realized, with a start, he wasn't thinking about business objectives or quarterly schedules for once. Lauren noticed his profound restraint and felt her shoulders lower just a little, the tension easing out of her neck, because she was entirely used to people reacting too quickly. Some instantly tried to fix things with loud sympathy. Others offered unwelcome, facile advice. Everett did neither, and that unexpected maturity genuinely surprised her. He simply asked how long ago it had been, his voice calm and unassuming. She answered without drama, because drama had already taken more than enough from her life. The girls immediately jumped back into the conversation, happily explaining how their father used to sing horribly off-key in the tiny kitchen every single Christmas Eve. They laughed warmly as they talked, correcting each other's small details, filling the space with active, present memory instead of sadness. Everett listened closely, not because he needed to, but because he deeply wanted to understand who this man had been to them. He found himself involuntarily imagining the scene. A small, brightly lit kitchen, simple, honest food, 3 voices overlapping in joy. It felt real in a way his own solitary, archived memories hadn't felt in years. At some point, Lauren asked Everett what he did for a living, clearly expecting a short, vague answer and a polite change of subject. When he told her he ran a technology company, she simply nodded without any hint of curiosity or admiration, which completely caught him off guard. She didn't ask how massive it was or what it was worth or what his title was. Instead, she asked if he liked it. The direct question landed harder than any aggressive shareholder interview he had ever endured. Everett hesitated because the honest answer wasn't something he said out loud very often. He explained that he liked the structure, the absolute sense of control, the intellectual clarity of knowing precisely what needed to be done each day. What he deliberately didn't say was that he used work as a constant, heavy grindstone to keep his mind busy enough not to wander back to the past. Lauren seemed to understand anyway, reading easily between his careful words without pressing him for detail. That quiet, immediate understanding made him feel strangely seen, stripped of his professional armor. The girls finished their main meals and immediately began drawing furiously on the paper placemats, completely absorbed in their shared world. They drew 4 colorful stick figures sitting at a table, one noticeably taller and sharper than the others. Ava pushed the drawing across the table toward Everett and asked if it looked correct. He nodded, swallowing hard, because something about the simple, innocent image felt heavier than any corporate merger document should have. It wasn't just what was drawn, but what was being offered, inclusion without expectation. Everett excused himself briefly and walked toward the tall window near the entrance, needing a moment to breathe without being obvious. He looked out at the snow-covered street, watching people pass by with overflowing bags, loud laughter, and urgent, definite places to go. For years, he had ruthlessly told himself that profound independence meant absolute strength and that solitude guaranteed peace. Standing there, observing the fleeting, messy warmth of the holiday, He realized how carefully he had avoided situations exactly like this one. Not because they hurt, but because they profoundly mattered. When he returned to the table, he made a sudden, firm decision that didn't feel logical in the slightest, but felt necessary for survival. He asked if Lauren and the girls would stay just a little longer, perhaps share dessert together. No pressure, no obligation, just an honest query. Lauren hesitated again, calculating complicated bedtime routines, subway schedules, and energy levels. The girls answered for her, their faces lighting up instantly at the prospect. In that moment, Everett chose, consciously, not to retreat, even though a terrified, habitual part of him desperately wanted to run. Dessert arrived slowly, a rich chocolate confection. 3 plates were placed in front of the girls, and 1 giant plate was placed in front of Everett, the kind obviously meant to be shared, even when no one says it out loud. Lauren thanked the waiter quietly, already reaching automatically for her thin wallet out of ingrained habit, then stopping instantly when Everett shook his head gently. There was no insistence, no grand, showy gesture, just a calm certainty that made refusal feel pointless and even slightly insulting. She nodded once, accepting without feeling small, and that nuanced exchange mattered more than either of them realized. The girls immediately leaned in, loudly negotiating bites and laughing when crumbs inevitably fell onto the table. As they ate, Everett asked the girls what they wanted to be when they grew up, expecting the usual answers, astronauts or veterinarians. Ava said she wanted to build strong, safe houses so people wouldn't have to move all the time. Lily said she wanted to help sick people feel less scared when they went to the doctor. Everett glanced at Lauren, surprised by the depth of the answers, and saw a flicker of deep, protective emotion cross her face before she swiftly steadied herself. These weren't fleeting childhood dreams taught lightly. They came from lived experience of scarcity and vulnerability. Lauren explained that stability and empathy had become their shared language over the difficult years. After their father passed, the girls had learned, prematurely, to pay attention to details most children never noticed. They watched for signs of adult stress, changes in tone, and moments when adults needed help but couldn't ask. Everett felt a familiar, aching tightness settle in his chest because he recognized that kind of harsh awareness too well. It was the awareness you develop when life teaches you early that nothing, especially love, is guaranteed. The conversation slowed, turning softer, less guarded, as if time itself had decided to be patient with them. Everett found himself sharing something he hadn't planned to say out loud to anyone. He spoke about the future he once imagined, the one that never arrived, the life he stopped talking about entirely. He didn't name the woman or detail the loss, but the meaning was achingly clear. Lauren listened without interrupting, without trying to offer manufactured comfort, and that was exactly what he needed. One of the girls looked up from her plate and asked him a simple question that no tactful adult would have asked so directly. "Do you still want that future?" Ava said, her voice steady and profoundly curious, not intrusive at all. Everett paused, completely surprised by how honest the question felt. He considered the answer carefully, because he refused to lie to a child who deserved the absolute truth. "Yes," he said finally, his voice slightly rough. "I think I do." The word hung in the air longer than expected, because it undeniably changed something fundamental between them. Lauren met his eyes, not with expectation, but with simple, shared recognition. She knew exactly what it meant to desperately want something after convincing yourself for years that you didn't anymore. The girls went back to their dessert, satisfied, as if the answer itself had completed a necessary task. Everett felt a strange warmth, a quiet energy he hadn't associated with hope in a very long time. Outside, snow continued to fall, softly insulating the city without asking permission. Inside, Everett realized he wasn't bracing for the end of the night anymore. He wasn't counting minutes or thinking about how to politely leave. He was present, fully, intentionally, physically present, and that terrifying possibility of change scared him more than solitude ever had. As the check arrived and Everett signed it without even glancing at the total, he made a quiet promise to himself. Not a promise about money or solutions or saving anyone. This was deeper, a silent vow of presence. A promise to stay open, even when it felt immensely risky, even when it would have been instinctively easier to withdraw, to return to the safe, sterile distance he had cultivated for years. He didn't know what this connection meant yet, and he didn't need to define it or categorize it. All he knew was that something essential had begun, a thread he had unconsciously pulled, and he wasn't ready to let it go or snip it short. When they said goodbye outside the restaurant that night, Everett expected the familiar, heavy drop in his chest. The emotional plummet that usually came when something genuinely good ended, signifying the return to emptiness. Instead, what he felt was unfinished, a quiet humming anticipation. Not painful, not urgent, just open, like a sentence that hadn't reached its final punctuation yet, waiting for the necessary clauses. Lauren thanked him again, this time meeting his eyes without hesitation or the need to look away, and that alone, that simple, sustained gaze, told him the night had fundamentally mattered. The girls hugged him quickly, confidently, the way children do when something feels absolutely safe, a gesture of unburdened trust, as they disappeared into the subway entrance. Everett stood there longer than he needed to, long after the chill should have sent him moving, letting the cold sink in as a kind of physical proof of reality. For years, he had trained himself to walk away cleanly, to preemptively close moments before they could complicate his meticulously ordered life. Tonight, he defied that training and didn't move right away. He replayed the sound of the girls laughing, a pure, unmanaged sound, the way Lauren had listened to him, truly listened, without trying to offer a strategic fix. It unsettled him in a deeply necessary way, jarring him out of a long-held equilibrium. The days that followed were busy in all the usual ways. The disciplined march of high-stakes commerce. Meetings, international travel, numbers that demanded instant attention and decisions that carried immense weight. Yet something subtle had changed in how Everett moved through them. He noticed himself pausing more often, questioning why certain metrics or deadlines still felt urgent. He found himself wondering what Lauren was doing at that exact moment, whether the girls were already asleep, tucked into their routine, whether the warmth of Christmas Eve had lingered for them, too, beyond the cleanup. Lauren tried to return to routine with stringent discipline because discipline was the mechanism by which she kept her life from falling apart entirely. Morning rushes, the constant negotiation of school lunches, the necessity of work shifts, the ritual of bedtime stories. Everything accounted for, locked down. But the girls kept bringing Everett up casually, without the pressure of expectation or longing. They talked about the restaurant, the decadent dessert, how he listened to them like their small, immediate thoughts were genuinely important. Lauren realized they weren't attaching to him as a person with resources, a potential benefactor, but as a reliable presence that felt steady and predictable in the best way. One night after the girls were asleep, Lauren sat alone at the small kitchen table and allowed herself the perilous luxury of thought. She hadn't done that in a long time without immediately censoring and shutting the thoughts down. Letting people in had always come with the inevitable risk of profound loss attached. But Everett hadn't pushed, hadn't promised, hadn't tried to insert himself or his resources into their tightly protected lives. That restraint made the connection feel safer, not weaker or ambiguous. Everett wrote the note slowly, deleting and rewriting it more times than his corporate ego cared to admit. He wanted it to sound honest without being heavy or demanding, open without being intrusive or manipulative. When he finally sent it, he felt exposed in a way success which required total control had never made him feel. There was no guarantee of response, no control over how it would be received, a true surrender, and that vulnerability stayed with him long after he pressed send. Lauren read the message late at night, sitting on the edge of her bed so the girls wouldn't hear her phone vibrate. A small, necessary secrecy. She reread it twice, then once more, methodically checking for the hidden subtext or hidden agenda that simply wasn't there. What she found instead was simple gratitude, unexpected clarity, and genuine respect for her boundaries. She responded simply, concisely, not because she wanted to deliberately keep distance, but because she wanted to build something slowly, deliberately, giving it time to set. That choice felt intentional, a conscious commitment, not defensive. Their communication settled into an easy, low-stakes rhythm that neither of them named or analyzed. Short, observational messages, occasional photos of mundane scenes, shared observations about ordinary days. There was no pressure to perform, no demand for reassurance. Everett learned how much intimacy, a genuine closeness, could exist without intensity or drama. Lauren learned that consistency didn't have to mean obligation or a crushing weight of expectation. Still, doubts surfaced, especially in quiet, late-night moments. Everett wondered whether he was stepping into a life he didn't fundamentally know how to sustain or maintain. Lauren wondered what it meant to allow her daughters to grow attached to someone again, potentially setting them up for renewed disappointment. Both of them felt the weight of responsibility differently, but equally, a silent, heavy consideration. Neither spoke those fears out loud yet, afraid of fracturing something newly fragile. The girls, however, sensed growth where adults sensed risk. They began including Everett in stories about the future without asking permission or seeing any obstacles. Small things like mentioning him casually when talking about next Christmas or summer plans, assuming his presence. Lauren noticed, corrected gently when absolutely needed, but didn't shut it down completely, trusting their instincts. She trusted her daughter's open, undiminished instincts more than she trusted her own cautiously guarded ones. Late one evening, Everett sat alone in his stark, pristine apartment, the city quieted and miniaturized beneath him. The silence that once felt comforting, a deserved retreat, now felt profoundly incomplete. He realized that solitude wasn't peace when it was chosen out of deep-seated fear. He didn't want to retreat again, to disappear back into his work, even though retreat had always been the path of least resistance. For the first time, he chose to stay present, mentally and emotionally, knowing it might change everything he had built. The envelope didn't arrive on a dramatic, fateful day. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, mixed in haphazardly with bank statements and routine mail, the kind Everett usually sorted without thinking, deferring the action. He almost tossed it aside, assuming it was another document that could wait indefinitely. What stopped him was the handwriting, careful, rounded letters, not rushed, not formal, but conspicuously intentional. He knew immediately it wasn't business, not part of his controlled world. That alone made his pulse change, a slight, noticeable acceleration. Inside the envelope, there was no long, detailed letter, no complex explanation, no emotional appeal demanding a reaction, just a folded piece of paper and a drawing tucked carefully inside, placed as if it profoundly mattered where it landed. The drawing showed 4 figures sitting at a table again, but this time the details were clearer, the lines more confident. 2 small girls leaning in toward a man. A woman sitting close, adjacent, not separate or defensive. Snow outside the window, warm, inviting light inside. At the bottom, written in uneven but focused letters, were the words, "Thank you for staying when you didn't have to." Everett sat down slowly, the paper still in his hand, because something about that sentence stopped him cold. Not because it was particularly kind, but because it was brutally accurate. For most of his adult life, staying had never been his instinct in personal matters. He stayed at work. He stayed in meetings. But when it came to emotional spaces, the places that carried risk, he had learned to leave early, strategically, before attachment could turn into inevitable, crushing loss. This note reframed that habit without accusing him or judging his past actions. It didn't judge. It just noticed the quiet shift. Lauren's letter was brief and direct, written the way someone writes when they actively don't want to manipulate emotion or create a debt. She explained that the girls had talked about that night more than she expected, weeks after it happened. Not as a transient surprise, but as proof. Proof that people could show up in their lives and leave without causing damage. Proof that kindness didn't always disappear the next day, evaporating under the sun of routine. She said the girls had slept better that week, calmer, lighter, and she wanted Everett to know that his presence had mattered in ways money or strategic effort never could. Everett read the letter twice, then again more slowly, absorbing what it meant beneath the simple words. He had spent years believing his value came from what he built and controlled, from the defensible asset. He had mastered outcomes, minimized risk, protected himself fiercely from variables. What Lauren described was fundamentally different. It was impact without strategy, meaning without control. He realized how foreign that concept had become to him, and how much he had desperately missed it, the feeling of simply matching. The drawing brought back a memory he usually kept locked away, tightly archived. Sitting on the floor of his old apartment years ago, listening to his former fiancée talk about the future, with an ease and certainty he never fully matched. She had talked about children as if they were inevitable, as if love naturally expanded outward, a gentle tide. Everett had smiled, nodded, told himself he would get there eventually, when the time was right, when his finances were perfect. Now, holding that drawing, he understood something painful and freeing at the same time. He hadn't been wrong to imagine that life. He had just been pathologically afraid to live it. That night, Everett didn't distract himself with late work or the numbing noise of the television. He placed the drawing on his desk and left it there, deliberately visible. He let the quiet exist without needing to fill it with sound or productivity. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like a heavy absence. It felt like space waiting to be used differently, to be filled by something real. He understood then that the night at the restaurant wasn't a coincidence or a comforting, self-contained moment he could archive and move on from. It was an intentional, ongoing invitation. Across the city, Lauren watched the girls color at the kitchen table, noticing how relaxed they were, how unguarded and unburdened they moved. She wondered if she had overstepped by sending the letter, making herself vulnerable, then reminded herself why she had done it. She was tired of teaching her daughters to expect disappearance, to anticipate the inevitable retreat. She wanted them to see that gratitude could be expressed without fear of reprisal, that adults could receive it without retreating, that honesty didn't always come with immediate, painful consequences. In different apartments under different ceilings, both Everett and Lauren reached the same understanding that night. The connection between them wasn't based on need or rescue or escapist fantasy. It was based on choice, a series of conscious decisions, and choice once recognized carries a profound, humbling responsibility. The question wasn't whether their lives had changed that night. They already had. The question was whether they were willing to let that change continue, to step fully into it. The next Christmas Eve didn't arrive with fireworks or some dramatic, pre-planned announcement. It just showed up the way life usually does, like a quiet, unscheduled test to see if you meant what you claimed a year ago. Everett Callahan had spent the morning working out of habit, then stopped halfway through a call and realized he was doing it again, automatically hiding inside productivity, using his business as a shield. He ended the call politely, changed into a simple, deliberately dark sweater, and stood by his apartment window for a long minute. The city looked exactly the same, immutable, but he didn't. He wasn't trying to be impressive tonight, he wasn't wearing his success. He was simply trying to be present. He arrived early at the restaurant, not because he wanted control over the situation, but because he didn't want them to walk in and not see him already there, waiting. The hostess recognized him again, smiling, and offered a private table, something quieter, removed from the crowd. Everett shook his head and asked for the exact same spot as last year, the table near the window. Not because he thought it was magical or destined, but because it was familiar, grounded. Familiar was no longer a trigger to flee. Familiar was becoming a home base, a point of return. When he sat down, he didn't reach for his phone, didn't use it as a social crutch. He placed it face down and let his hands rest openly on the table. He looked around and noticed something strange. The room was full, buzzing with festive energy, but he didn't feel surrounded or overwhelmed. He felt included, part of the fabric, even before anyone arrived. Lauren came in a few minutes later, a little breathless, and Everett stood up without thinking. A sudden, unlearned reflex, like his body had learned a new grammar of courtesy. Ava and Lily ran ahead, the same bright red bows in their hair, the same bright, assessing eyes, but taller, quicker, and louder in the most wonderful way. They didn't ask permission to hug him. They didn't hesitate. They wrapped their arms tightly around his waist, and Everett felt that old instinct to freeze, to keep an emotional distance, to manage and control the incoming emotion. He didn't follow it. He bent down, hugged them back fiercely, and realized he had missed this kind of unguarded contact more than he ever allowed himself to admit. Lauren watched, her expression careful at first, a flicker of assessment, then visibly softening when she saw the interaction wasn't forced or performative. It was entirely natural. They sat and the girls immediately started talking about their year like Everett had been there for all of it, an assumed continuous presence. School projects, a teacher who was perhaps too strict, a classmate who cried in the bathroom, and how Lily gave her a tissue, the small, vital details of their lives. Everett asked questions that proved he remembered details from their last conversation. A year prior. He remembered the girl's favorite dessert. He remembered the specific name of the neighbor who helped Lauren with pickup times. He remembered the tiny things that signaled to Lauren he wasn't collecting memories for a future dramatic narrative or grand gesture. He was collecting them because he genuinely cared about their continuity. Lauren didn't say anything right away, but she breathed differently, deeply, like her body finally understood she didn't have to stay braced and defensive. Halfway through the meal, Lauren excused herself to the restroom, and Everett stayed alone at the table with the girls. Ava leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper like she was sharing a secret that deeply mattered. She said their mom had been nervous all day, not because she didn't want to come, she clarified, but because she didn't want to hope too hard, didn't want to be disappointed. Lily nodded in agreement and added that their mom still woke up early, even on days off, like she couldn't fully afford to relax or trust stability. Everett listened, not trying to seize the moment to be the hero, not promising anything huge or immediate. He just told them he was deeply glad they came and that their mom was doing an incredible job raising them. The girls accepted that like it was a fact, an objective truth, not an empty compliment. When Lauren came back, the girls pulled out a folded paper from Ava's backpack with the seriousness and ritual of a ceremony. It was another drawing, notably more detailed than last year's. For people in heavy winter coats walking through falling snow, and in the background, the restaurant window glowing warmly. Under it in careful, deliberate block letters, Ava had written, "Families can start anytime." Everett stared at it longer than he meant to, his throat tightened by the sudden, raw emotion. But he didn't look away or deflect. He didn't joke it off or minimize it. He let the moment land, absorbing its full weight. Lauren watched his face and saw something she hadn't seen in a man in a long time. A man who wasn't actively running from feeling. Lauren spoke quietly, then, choosing her words carefully, like someone who understood the power and lasting consequence of them. She said she wasn't interested in rushing anything or creating false speed, and she wasn't asking for premature promises. She said what mattered to her was consistency, unshakable safety, and the continued shared choice. She said her daughters had been through enough unsettling change and she had too. Everett nodded, not offended, not defensive, but genuinely relieved by the honesty. He told her he understood completely. He told her he wasn't here to fill a required role or check a box. He was here to show up again and again because he wanted to, purely and simply. That quiet, intentional honesty hit Lauren harder than any grand romantic flourish ever could, because it wasn't a fantasy. It was a clear, actionable decision. When the check came, Everett didn't make a show of it, didn't reach for his wallet ostentatiously. He simply handled it the way he handled so many things now, efficiently, quietly, without needing applause or acknowledgement. Outside, as they walked toward the subway entrance, Ava reached for his hand like it was the most normal thing in the world. Lily reached for Lauren's hand, and the four of them moved through the sidewalk crowd like a small, self-contained unit, not pretending to be something they weren't yet, but also not denying what they were intentionally becoming. At the entrance, the girls hugged Everett again, quickly and surely, and promised to send him another drawing soon. Lauren looked at him, hesitated for just a moment, then said simply, "Thank you for staying." Everett answered with a simple, deeply grounded, "I'm not going anywhere." Tonight, it wasn't a soaring, fragile vow. It was settled presence. Back in his apartment later, Everett placed the drawings side by side on his polished desk. Last year's and this year's. He realized healing didn't magically erase the scars of the past. It made the past stop controlling the future's direction. He looked around the room and noticed it didn't feel like a display of success and isolation anymore. It felt like a space someone else could walk into, a life with room. He picked up his phone, typed a message to Lauren, then paused before sending it. Not because he was afraid of rejection, but because he wanted to choose the right, true words. And when he finally hit send, he knew one thing clearly. This wasn't a fairy tale, wrapped up neatly with a bow. This was real life. And real life, messy, demanding, and utterly without guarantees, was finally starting to feel worth staying in. Thanks for listening. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that remind us that goodness is still alive in the world. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. See you in the next story.